Wow, listeners are really fascinated by the Lucy Letby case, huh? So many requests for a deep dive.
Yeah, it's definitely captured the public's attention.
It's complex, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So we've got a ton of material to work with. Court transcripts, articles, expert opinions.
It's going to be quite a journey.
It seems like there's more to this case than meets the eye, you know? Let's try to break it down, cut through the noise, and see what the evidence actually tells us.
Sounds good.
So before all these accusations came out, who was Lucy Letby?
Well, based on what we know about her early life and career, she seemed like, someone who genuinely wanted to care for others.
Really? From a young age?
Yeah, she wanted to be a nurse since she was young.
Uh,
Close friends describe her as kind and gentle.
that doesn't sound like someone who.
Right. Even her colleagues at the Countess of Chester Hospital, they spoke highly of her.
Right.
Dedicated, caring.
Hmm. So we have this picture of a seemingly normal young woman who dedicated her life to this profession. Then she starts working at the Countess of Chester's neonatal unit.
Hmm.
What was going on there at the time? What was the environment like?
Ah, well, that's important context, right?
Right.
Reports show there were serious staffing shortages, huge pressure on the staff. They were even expected to work when they were ill.
Wow.
Parents were already raising concerns about the quality of care, And then you add things like a soilage leak.
Okay, hold on. What's a soilage leak?
Basically, a lack of sewage or bodily fluids.
Oh, that's
Not good, right?
yeah.
Especially in a neonatal unit, you've got these incredibly fragile babies. Immune systems aren't fully developed.
Right.
Huge infection risk. And on top of that, there was a persistent Pseudomonas infection on the ward.
Pseudomonas.
Yeah, a type of bacteria, pretty dangerous for anyone with a weakened immune system.
So this wasn't exactly the ideal setting for these babies.
No, not at all. Far from it, actually.
And this is all happening while the unit's seeing a rise in mortality rates.
Yeah. That's right. In 2015, there was this alarming increase in infant deaths. Obviously, everyone was scrambling to figure out why.
Makes sense. And this is when Lucy Letby becomes a suspect.
Well, she was present at a lot of these deaths, so.
Ah, I see. But just because she was there doesn't mean she's responsible.
Exactly. Correlation doesn't equal causation, as they say.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
There were so many potential factors at play. The staffing issues, the pressure, the hygiene problems we talked about. And of course, the infants themselves might have had underlying medical complexities. To just jump to Letby being the sole cause ignores all that nuance.
It does feel like a very quick leap. So how did she become the prime suspect? What made the focus shift to her?
Well, some senior pediatricians, Dr. Jairam and Dr. Breary, they started noticing this pattern of Letby being present at a lot of these deaths. They found it statistically unusual, started raising concern.
So they were trying to make sense of this, tragic situation with very limited information at that point.
Yeah,
Now, what happened next?
Well, instead of really investigating everything, all the possible causes, the hospital executives weren't keen on getting the police involved right away.
They weren't.
No. They decided to downgrade the level of care on the ward, and they commissioned an external review. But even that review mainly focused on the staffing problems. Didn't really find anything concrete, like evidence of intentional harm.
So no clear evidence against Letby yet, but suspicions are growing.
Right.
What finally triggered the police investigation?
It was really the persistence of Dr. Jairam and Dr. Breary. They kept pushing, kept voicing their concerns. And eventually, Operation Hummingbird, the police investigation, was launched.
And this is when retired pediatrician Dewey Evans gets involved.
That's right.
He was a big part of the prosecution's case.
Oh, yeah, central figure.
Yeah.
His testimony was all about air embolism as a cause of death, and he mainly based that on a 1989 research paper. The thing is, the authors of that paper, they've actually disputed its relevance to the Letby case.
Seriously. That seems, in a case this big, that seems like a pretty big detail to miss.
It does, doesn't it? And what's even more concerning is that the post-mortem examinations, they didn't actually find any physical evidence of air embolism.
So he basically came to that conclusion by ruling everything else out.
Basically, yeah. Diagnosis of exclusion, they call it. Pretty controversial in a case like this.
So we've got a hospital under a lot of pressure, a series of tragic deaths, and an expert witness relying on a theory that's, disputed.
To say the least.
Things are definitely starting to get complicated here.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And this is all happening, and all the while, Lucy Letby is saying she's innocent.
That's right. Throughout all of this, she maintained her innocence, seemed shocked by the accusations, confused.
I can imagine.
People who knew her, they just couldn't believe she'd be capable of something like that. She was caring, dedicated to her job.
So then comes the arrest, and that kicks off what becomes a very public trial. That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
So we're picking back up with the trial, right? But before we get into that, it's important to consider what Lucy Letby was going through at this point.
Yeah, I mean, being at the center of a police investigation like that, accused of,
It's hard to even imagine. You're a young nurse, you've dedicated your life to caring for others, and suddenly you're being accused of harming the very infants you were supposed to protect.
the emotional toll must have been immense, especially with the media attention and everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about the trial itself. What were the prosecution's main arguments?
Well, their case really hinged on circumstantial evidence.
Circumstantial.
Yeah. They focused a lot on the statistical probability of Letby being present when those deaths occurred. And of course, Dewey Evans's testimony about air embolism played a big role.
Right, right.
They painted her as this, common denominator, like she was the only consistent factor in all these tragedies.
But like we talked about earlier, there were so many other factors at play in that hospital environment.
Exactly. And the medical evidence was far from conclusive.
Did the defense bring up any alternative explanations for the baby's deaths?
Oh, absolutely. Their argument was that focusing solely on Letby was a way to kind of deflect from, the bigger picture,
The bigger picture being,
the systemic failures within the NHS and specifically at the Countess of Chester Hospital. They pointed to the substandard care, the chronic staff shortages, all the hygiene issues we discussed.
so they were basically saying the hospital itself was partly to blame.
That was their argument, yeah. That focusing on Letby as this individual villain distracted from a more systemic understanding of what went wrong.
Interesting. And they didn't have any concrete evidence linking her to the deaths either, right?
Right. No eyewitnesses, no confession. And like you said, the medical evidence was highly disputed. They argued that the deaths were more likely the result of, a combination of unfortunate events and maybe some oversights, not the deliberate actions of one person.
That must have been a lot for the parents of those babies to process. Losing a child is already unimaginable, and then to be told it was deliberate, and then to hear these alternative explanations.
It's heartbreaking. They were searching for answers, trying to make sense of this unbelievable tragedy, and instead they were caught in this battle of narratives.
So the prosecution was pushing the killer nurse story, and the defense was arguing for this more systemic view.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
How did Letby respond to all of this during the trial?
She maintained her innocence throughout the entire trial, took the stand, denied the accusations, seemed genuinely baffled by the whole thing.
It must have been incredibly difficult to go through that.
I can't even imagine. And for people who knew her, it was impossible to believe that she could be capable of something like that.
So what was the verdict?
Well, the jury really struggled to reach a unanimous decision.
They did.
Oh, yeah. They deliberated for days, finally settled on a majority verdict for most of the charges.
Even the jury wasn't completely convinced.
It seems that way, right? Even with a guilty verdict, there were still all these questions, these uncertainties.
And that brings us to what happened after the trial, right?
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Because some new information came to light that really cast doubt on the verdict.
Hold on. Are you talking about Dr. Shu Lee?
You got it. Remember, he co-authored that 1989 paper on air embolism that Dewey Evans based his whole testimony on. Well, he became increasingly concerned about how his research was being used in the Letby case. He actually put together an independent expert panel to review all the medical evidence.
Wow. So the expert whose research was used to convict her decided to take a second look.
Yeah, pretty incredible, right? And what they found was, well, it basically blew the prosecution's case out of the water. Their conclusion was that there was no medical evidence to support those murder charges.
Are you serious? That's huge.
It was a bombshell. Completely undermined the prosecution's entire narrative. It wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was a complete dismantling of the theory they used to convict her.
So what happened then? Did Letby's lawyers appeal?
Absolutely. Her case was submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC. They investigate potential miscarriages of justice.
And they could overturn the verdict.
If they think there are grounds for it, yeah, they can refer the case back to the Court of Appeal.
So there's hope for Letby.
It's a long shot. The CCRC, they have a really high bar for overturning convictions, and they've got a huge backlog of cases. But, this case, it's high profile, and there's this potential miscarriage of justice. those things might work in her favor.
So it's a waiting game now.
Yeah.
But the stakes are high, not just for Lucy Letby, but for the whole justice system. This case shows how a narrative can just take over, even when the evidence isn't clear.
It does make you think, doesn't it? This case is about so much more than just one person. It raises questions about expert testimony, investigations, accountability within institutions like the NHS. It's a reminder to be skeptical, to question what we're told, to demand better from our systems, especially when the stakes are this high.
We've covered a lot, but there's still so much to unpack. I'm really curious about the impact of all of this on the families involved, the hospital staff, the public's perception of healthcare.
Yeah, the human impact of this case is huge. We can't ignore that.
Definitely. Let's explore those aspects in part 3 of our deep dive. We've really been digging into the legal and medical stuff, but
Yeah.
what about the people? The human side of this whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about that. This case, it's touched so many lives.
Let's start with the families of those babies.
Yeah.
They lost their children, and then they're told it was intentional, and then there's this possibility that it wasn't.
It's unimaginable the pain they must be going through.
It really is.
First, the loss itself, which is just devastating. Then to be told it was deliberate, that someone they trusted hurt their child.
And now this new information potentially pointing to negligence instead.
Exactly. It's like they're on this terrible roller coaster, constantly searching for answers, for some kind of justice. And it just keeps getting more complicated, more painful.
They deserve answers though, right?
Of course. But what they've gotten is this constant back and forth, these conflicting narratives.
It's just awful.
Some families, they've held on to that initial verdict, finding some comfort in the idea that someone was held accountable.
I can understand that.
Others, though, they've embraced the possibility of Letby's innocence. They want a full investigation into the hospital, a re-examination of everything.
Which makes sense too.
It's such a personal, individual journey for each family. There's no right or wrong way to feel.
Definitely.
But one thing's for sure, the impact on them has been profound. It's something they'll carry with them forever.
It's not just the families, though. Think about the hospital staff. They're caring for these tiny babies, and then their whole workplace becomes the center of this national scandal.
Right, and for those who worked closely with Letby, who never suspected anything.
That must be so jarring.
A lot of them testified, and you could see the shock, the disbelief. They described her as competent, caring. They just couldn't reconcile that image with these accusations.
Makes you wonder how we perceive people, right? How easily our judgments can be clouded.
Definitely. And let's not forget, the staff were also deeply affected by the deaths of those babies.
Oh yeah, of course. They're the ones who cared for them day in and day out.
It's tragic for them, too. And then to have their own competence questioned, their practices scrutinized, it just adds another layer of trauma to an already difficult situation.
This whole case has really shaken public trust in the NHS, hasn't it?
I think it has. The idea that a hospital could be so flawed that negligence could contribute to the deaths of multiple infants? It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. And it makes you question what else is being overlooked. What other systemic issues are out there?
Right, and that's the conversation we need to be having. This case, it's brought to light the pressures healthcare workers face, the potential for things to slip through the cracks.
The need for better oversight, more accountability.
Absolutely. It's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our healthcare system.
And it goes beyond healthcare, right? This case also makes you think about the legal system, how medical evidence is presented.
Oh, definitely.
The power of narratives, the potential for bias.
It's a reminder that justice isn't always straightforward, that things aren't always black and white.
Exactly.
We have to be critical thinkers, be skeptical, be willing to question everything.
We started this deep dive trying to make sense of the Lucy Letby case and what seemed like a clear-cut case of a killer nurse. Well, it turned into something much bigger, much more complicated. It challenges our ideas about guilt, innocence, individual versus systemic responsibility. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we may never have all the answers. But we hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically, to question assumptions, to recognize that even in the most complex cases, there's a human element that can't be ignored.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.